Hello again, whiskey friends. Thanks for joining everybody for another whiskey review. And today we are going to be talking about the New Riff 8-year rye. This is a new release coming from New Riff. I got this straight from the distillery, though this is supposed to be more available as time goes on everywhere that New Riff is distributed. Now, earlier this year, New Riff came out with an 8-year bourbon that I was raving about. Gave it an 84 out of 100. Let's see how I grade out the rye. So thank you for joining today, whiskey friends. Let's kick off the show. All right. Let's get a little sample poured in here. And with that, too, cheers to everyone over there at 2B1B. Cheers to Columbus, Ohio in general. Go, Ohio. So, with this release, as stated up front, and I'll pull up the details here, this is an 8-year age-stated product now from New Riff, right on the heels of the bourbon release. So this essentially dropped at the distillery in May 2024. The bourbon was a few months before that. I didn't even know this was coming out. It was kind of like a shock drop thing where they just sent an email and said, hey, show up on the distillery on a Saturday and pick these up. And I went and I grabbed 2 bottles. It did cost $70. And as I said in the intro, it is supposed to be part of their core release. So if New Riff is distributed in your area, I mean, hopefully as time goes on, this fans out and becomes more widely available across the US. It is 100 proof, though not bottle and bond. It's just stated 100 proof. And age, as said, is at least 8 years. So age year, eight year age statement. Whew. Got tongue-tied on that. So let's get into it here and let's see what I think of this in terms of just the rye overall, and then I'll have some closing remarks in comparison to the bourbon. So cheers, everybody. We're going to go through the nose, the palate, and then we'll go through the finish, go through the flavor notes, and then I'll show you the final scores at the end and where this ranks on the year. Cheers, whiskey friends. Ooh, that was a good sniff. Just like the bourbon, sometimes I get a whiff of this thing, and oak is the main thing I get. Sometimes it comes across older than 8. Now, I understand on the back of it, it says at least 8 years. So I don't know if they put older casks in there. They're about to come out with something that might actually have like 9 and 10-year-old casks. So they do have older casks. I don't know if they use those in the blends or not. But to that point, even on the nose, when it comes to the oak, and I'll get to the other flavors in a moment, compared this to the Knob Creek 10-year, this comes across older on the nose and on the palate than the Knob Creek 10-year. So that oak profile that I'm talking about is just a lot more dense. Another flavor I get in this, and I get it through pretty much throughout the entire experience, so you'll hear me essentially bring up the same tasting notes over and over again, but blackberry jam. You know, a lot of the times on the New Riff Rye, I got some fruits. They really darkened up and sweetened with age, and I'm going with the blackberry jam as kind of that consolidation there. There's also these like dark teas. The tea maybe has a little bit of mint in it, but for the most part, very dark leaning in terms of the leaves that are in there. And then the last thing I get is almost like a cinnamon roll, but an uncooked cinnamon roll at that, almost the dough of the cinnamon roll. Man, that oak is really hitting me today. It smells old. So when it comes to the nose, gave this one a thumbs up. I do enjoy the nose on this, though I will say it lacks a certain depth that maybe I was expecting based on the depth I've got out of some of the 4 years. It's almost like the age, I don't know, it didn't make it more complex like it does maybe with a bourbon. It's a very strange concept, and I'll try to articulate that more as we go through the tasting notes. So let's get into the palate. Mm. Mm. Man, that was one heck of a first sip. Up front, again, it's kind of those same notes, and I'm just going to keep saying those same notes again. Sweet blackberry jam, followed by a medley of like tea leaves. And then the other thing I pick up is almost like a sweet cream. So if you mix some cream in your tea, there's also a bit of a slight pepper, and I get a little burnt toast up front as well. Let's get into mid palate. The transition to mid palate, all the notes are the same. It's the same flavors. The blackberry jam on toast, followed by dark tea and a little bit of that sweet cream. So I'm still getting essentially the same thing. The oak isn't going to show up until the finish. So we'll get to the oak here in just a minute. But the while I say the oak doesn't show up on the finish, the whole palate just has this dark richness to it, just this base. It almost lives in that zone in a lot of ways. Luckily, there's some sweetness to overpower it, but it is interesting just how dense and dark this thing is for being 8 years old. So then with the palate, I'm going to give this one thumbs up. Debated thumb sideways just due to some of the lack of complexity there, but ultimately I am giving it a thumbs up. And really on this sip too, I'm agreeing with that statement. So now let's get into the finish. Mm. Finish, same notes again, leaning into blackberry tea, the blackberry jam, tea, sweet cream, pepper, a little bit of that cinnamon roll, unbaked cinnamon rolls coming through, and then the oak. The oak sits there, and man, is it dark and hits along the sides of the tongue in particular. I'm interested to hear Kelsey's feedback on this one. I do wonder if he thinks this one might turn even too tannic in the end. I think there's enough sweetness there to balance it out, but I know he's more sensitive to that than I am. Yeah, and just that velvety oak at the end. Once again, comes off older than 8 years. So with the finish, yeah, again, I'm not turned off by that tannic note that I'm referring to when all of that oak starts hitting you. So I'm giving that a thumbs up as well. So that's going to be 3 thumbs up for me all the way through the experience, though I did teeter a little bit on whether I was going to give a thumbs up on the palate or not. So let me get one more sip and then we'll get into final thoughts here. Mm. Man, it's good. I'll tell you what, it got better too as I got further down the bottle. Now I know I'm like halfway down here, but I didn't drink all this. This is a whole lot of samples in between. But I will say something about that got better than some of my initial impressions as I was going through, though mostly the flavor notes I think have been consistent throughout. It didn't flourish or have add any depth, but I will say the balance between the sweetness and the oak is actually what emerged as I got deeper into the bottle. So then in terms of the final scores, there's a whole bunch of metrics behind the scenes here. I know I summarize it with all these thumbs up, thumbs down things. But ultimately, there's 10 questions that we answer as we're reviewing a whiskey. And then you can summarize those 10 metrics into a flavor score, an experience score, and a value score. Flavor score essentially got eights across the board. So that gives it 80% of the possible points. Experience, once again, there's a little bit of a lack of depth here that's coming into play with this experience score, balanced out by the fact that even at 100 proof, it does have a good mouthfeel and a decent finish. And then with the value score, gave it 9 out of 10 on value. It does cost $70. I'd be a lot more comfortable around the $60 mark than 70. There's just a lot of other cast strength rise at 70 that makes me doubt it a little bit. And I said the exact same thing about the Knob Creek 10-year when that came out around a similar price point, though I do like this over the Knob Creek 10-year, which we'll see here reflected in the scores. So then as a final score, it's an 80 out of 100 is where that comes in. Ranks 28 out of 43 of all the reviews done thus far this year. And all time, 95 out of 196. So kind of a middle of the road score, something that's very enjoyable, but not something I'm going to be shouting from the rooftops, and not something I'm going to be recommending probably as much as the bourbon. If I had both the rye and the bourbon on the shelf at the same time, the 8-year age stated ones, I would go with the bourbon 9 out of 10 times. And I would not have said the same about single barrel ryes that were 4 years old from New Riff. I swayed towards the rye probably 60% of the time compared to the bourbon the last couple of years. So I've kind of got this flip flop going on. We will see if they open up single barrels of both the bourbon and the rye 8 years or more. Where I go from there, really interested to explore this a bit more. The other interesting thing about this one, too, being a 95.5 rye, it is drifting in a different direction than MGP. So I am excited about that prospect, though. At least using the same mash bill, they are going in a entirely somewhat different direction, especially with how much fruit and how much tea was coming off of it versus any overwhelming mintiness or dill or anything like that that you can sometimes get on the MGP with that exact same mash bill. So those are the final thoughts then on the New Riff 8-year rye. Curious if you have had this, what did you think? Put it in the comments. Also, let me know in terms of the tasting notes. So you getting that blackberry jam? That's the one that I wrestle with the most. And we will catch you on the next whiskey review. Goodbye, everybody.